Our story begins in the early spring of 1999. Deep within the lush forests of America, a very unique event occurred. A blue bear was born. The blue bear was named Darrow, a unique name for a unique bear, and never wanted to leave the comfort of the forest. One day, Darrow was looking for some fish by the river when he spotted something he had never seen before. A human. The human and Darrow could not take their eye off of each other. The human purely out of shock and awe, and Darrow out of fear. Darrow knew he was different from any other member of the sleuth, so he knew what the humans would do if he was caught. Darrow ran away as quickly as possible back into the deepest parts of the forest in hopes no one could find him. Days, weeks, even months went by with no other incidents happening to Darrow, so he figured it would be okay to try to get some food by the river for his sleuth. Everything felt better this time. The smell of the air, the amount of fish in the water, and the temperature. After catching some fish and relaxing by the river, Darrow decided he should get back home. But when he got there, everyone was gone, and there were humans scanning the forest for something. Him. Quickly, Darrow rushed over to some cover in hopes to hide from these humans. The humans looked very similar to the human he saw months before at the river. Could they be connected somehow? Darrow thought. Waiting until the coast was clear, Darrow went over to the main resting area for his sleuth and saw something he would never be able to unsee. Darrow looked down to see one of his own covered in blood, lifeless on the ground. Darrow, distraught from the sight, roared out to no avail. He was gone, and Darrow couldn't bring him back. Before Darrow had time to process what he had just seen, he felt a sharp poke on his back. Darrow turned around to see a human dressing the same way as the others, holding what looked to be a gun. Darrow couldn't keep his eyes open any longer and passed out. Darrow groggily opened his eyes, unfamiliar with his surroundings, and looked around the room. Everything was either white or stainless steel. Darrow had never seen anything like this back in the forest. Starting to come to, Darrow realized he was locked in a cage and were other members of his sleuth, including his mother. Darrow, enraged by the sight, started to thrash around in the cage. The humans took notice and swarmed around Darrow, looking concerned about the survivability of the cage. Fearing for their safety, one of the humans unlocked a heavy-looking safe to grab a green, somewhat fluorescent liquid in the syringe. The human with a long white coat injected the green liquid into Darrow in hopes it would calm him down. Darrow quickly started to calm down into a deep sleep, and the humans surrounding Darrow had no idea what this brave scientist had done to calm the beast. I guess it really does work, said the scientist. The other scientists glared over to the excited team member. One of the scientists asked, Professor, what did you put in this bear?
Just some standard grade tranquilizer serum.
The professor exclaimed. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop until something very peculiar had started to occur with Darrow. Darrow started vibrating heavily, but the professor thought none of it and ordered the workday over. The professor and his colleagues left the room and turned the lights off, only to find out when they came back the next day, they would see something that would change their lives forever. The next day, the scientists and the professor came back to the lab to find an impossible sight. Darrow was gone. With no sign of the blue-haired beast, the scientists spread out, looking anywhere and everywhere for Darrow, until an unusual sound rang out from under the lab's main sink. The professor timidly walked over to the sink bent down and opened the sink cabinet to find something that shouldn't be on Earth. Out of the cabinet slid a blue, gelatinous being with brown eyes and little bare ears. The professor was in shock as he discovered the serum he gave Darrow was not tranquilizer, but instead a concoction the lab was working on for the government that caused the recipient to turn into a slime. All the scientists gathered around the gelatinous Darrow as he slept. They picked him up carefully as he was hard to hold without dropping and placed him back in the cage. Later that day, Darrow finally came to, and when he realized what had happened to him, he let out a roar that ended up sounding just like a human scream. Scaring himself quiet, Darrow tried to see if he could really speak like a human, so he called out for help, yelling,
Help!
The professor ran over to Darrow asking,
Did you just say that?
in which Darrow replied,
Well, it wasn't one of your dumbasses, was it?
starting to feel bad about what has occurred. The professor apologizes for what has happened and tells Darrow there is no reversal drug, explaining that the government gave him 2 doses of the invaluable extract and didn't know what he gave Darrow was one of them. Darrow, getting more and more angry by the second, starts to steam as he lights into the professor.
You gave me a government bioweapon because I was mad?
The professor, sweating profusely, states,
I'm so sorry. I didn't know that's what it did.
Darrow, even more mad, slides his way to the edge of the countertop and lights into the professor even more.
My mother is in that cage by the doorway, and you want to apologize to me?
Without missing a beat, Darrow slips off the countertop onto the floor and starts to vibrate once again. Slowly, the slime began to stretch and mold itself into a bear. Darrow's gelatinous form started to grow muscle and fur until soon enough he was his old self again. Towering over the professor, Darrow lets out a massive roar while grabbing the professor up by the head. In one clean motion, Darrow ripped the professor's head off and threw his lifeless body to the corner of the room. Darrow looks down at the dismembered head and sees his blood-soaked fur through the professor's glasses and realizes what he has done. His mother calls out.
Darrow, son, come here.
Darrow walks over to his mother, putting his paw on the cage. Darrow's mom, looking rather sick, motioned over to a pill bottle. Darrow picked up the bottle and looked at the label.
Experiment 13.
Darrow stated. Confused, he brought the bottle over to his mother.
These are what the scientists were keeping from humanity, to keep creatures like us held down under them.
His mother stated.
Take one with me.
Darrow and his mother took one of the pills and started feeling nauseated and dizzy shortly after. Both Darrow and his mom pass out from the mystery pill only to be woken up surrounded by scientists and his mom nowhere in sight. Darrow, out of fear, strikes one of the scientists and feels a sharp pain under his eye. Noticing the injury, he looks at the scientist and the human looks back with just as much fear. These were not normal humans. These were also not scientists. These were nurses. Darrow was shocked to see a nurse hovering over him. Hoping he can still talk, Darrow says,
Where am I?
The nurse states,
Sir, we found you passed out in the laboratory outside of town next to an older lady. We got you guys here as soon as we could.
Darrow looks around.
Could I see a mirror?
He asks. The thing he saw was something he could never forget or take back. Looking into the mirror, Darrow saw a human face with human features but big blue bear ears stood atop his head. He opened his mouth, revealing sharp, bear-like incisors. He looked at the nurse.
What happened? I was a bear 1 minute, and the next, I'm this thing.
The nurse, looking at Darrow with sympathy, says,
I wish I knew. We know about your sleuth, it's been in the news. I'm really not sure how you and your mom made it out or how you transformed into humans.
Darrow broke down, sobbing uncontrollably into the nurse's shoulder. It was a very hard chapter of his life he could be entering. Months went by. Darrow and his mom had recovered from the incident, and Darrow was finding out new things about what he was capable of. Darrow found out he could transform into a bear, slime, and back into a human at will. His mother was not so fortunate, as she was a human and could not go back no matter how hard she tried. She had a hard time with this, but soon found it to be a blessing. Darrow found out that he and his mom were the only survivors of the slaughter of his sleuth. His friends, father, cousins, all gone. In this period of time, Darrow knew to survive, he would have to do something to sustain himself. So he started applying to jobs and tried making friends. He never got replies back for jobs due to his unique features and lackluster education. Darrow did meet some cool people in this period of his life and made some amazing friends. The first time this happened, it was a snowy, windy day, and Darrow was going door to door, fulfilling out applications, only to be turned down. After his last application was denied, he was walking home and slipped on an ice path, causing him to fall backwards and hit his head. He woke up in the hospital with IVs in his arm and someone sitting beside him. They looked different, like him, but with cat ears and glasses. Darrow looked over to them and asked,
Who are you? And why am I in the hospital?
The individual looked over to Darrow with a friendly smile and said,
My name is Shadow. I brought you here when I found you passed out on the sidewalk.
Oh shit. This sucks. I don't have the money for this to be happening right now.
After trying to live in society, Darrow felt like an outsider. He got a little help from the government, but that was running out quickly. They had no place to go. Shadow saw the concern in his eyes. They stood up and walked out of the room for some time, only to come back and sit down.
Where did you go?
Darrow asked.
I told the nurse I'd take care of the bill. Don't worry about it.
Darrow smiled at Shadow, and without saying a word, broke down into tears. Darrow and Shadow would continue to stay in contact, and in that period of time, Shadow would show Darrow all about the online world. One day, after Darrow bought a PC to watch shows on, he saw a site that caught his interest. A site where people can play games, talk, or anything in between, and people can watch. Darrow called Shadow and asked them about the site and if they knew how to do what these people were doing. Shadow replied.
Yeah, I can show you. I actually stream myself.
Darrow would watch Shadow and pick up on how video games and streaming software worked. After many late nights of setting everything up, Darrow started to stream almost every day. Through streaming, Darrow met many amazing people and made friendships that would continue to grow. Because of all of you, Darrow has become the bear he always hoped he could be, continue to grow and evolve. On that note, make yourself at home in Darrow's cozy cabin.